Okay, welcome back, class. We are now looking at the fourth video in our biological basis section. This is covering pages 74 to 79 in the Myers textbook. I would use pages 10 probably for your notes, 10 and 11. And again, if there's notes on here that are not on your note packet, you might want to include them somewhere. So let's go back to the regions of the brain which we've been talking about for the past couple videos here. The regions of the brain start with the hindbrain, the oldest structures, the structures for survival. That moves to the midbrain, which controls your sensory input and your memory processing. We learned in the last section about the limbic system, which is mostly controlling your emotion, hunger, and memory, known as a part of the forebrain. And the second part of the forebrain we're going to look at is the cerebrum. Okay, otherwise known sometimes as the cerebral cortex. This is the most sophisticated system of thinking. This is what separates us from other species because we do have these this gray matter. Okay, it's what elevates us. We have the most sophisticated systems of thinking. The logic is centered here. Okay, so not a lot of animals have the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex, the first part, if you kind of take a look at it here, you could notice there's four big areas. The front portion, which is your frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, which is in orange, the green, which is the occipital, and the pink, which is the temporal. And back here you have your cerebellum. I might stop and freeze. This is a really good drawing. I might have this in my notes for class. Okay, so when you look at the human brain, the majority of what you see is the cerebral cortex. It's the gray matter. Okay, the major lobes of the brain, I want to make sure you know one more time, are the frontal, the temporal, the parietal, and the occipital. Okay, within each lobe, we're going to talk about specific functions and association areas. The cerebral cortex is placed where sensory impulses concerning sight, sound, taste, smell, and touch are interpreted. Those are the four regions. Okay, this is the area of thought and intelligence. 85% of the brain's weight comes from the cortex. It makes us different from different species. Cerebral cortex is made up of gyra, okay, which is the gray matter. The cortex is mainly composed of neurons, nerves, and the glial cells. The glial are the supports for the nerve cells. It's the glue that holds everything together. And mostly there's inner nerve cells in the cerebral cortex. Okay, in 1955, what they did learn about the cortex, they did a lot of exploration of Albert Einstein. Yes, after obviously he died. And his cortex was tighter packed than most humans, permitting him more connections and of information. So what they believe is, no, not your brain, the bigger it is, the smarter you are, but maybe the tighter that cortex is together, maybe that can kind of increase your intelligence. So here again are the four lobes, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Okay, within each of the different lobes is what's called association areas. These are areas within the cerebral cortex that are not involved with motor and sensory. Rather, they're involved in the higher mental functioning, like learning, memory, and speaking. So when we get to each lobe, you'll probably see that each lobe has a function of like your senses or your motor ability, but they also have an area that deals with like higher level thinking. And you need to know the roles of both of them within each lobe. And I broke it down for you. So the frontal, you can see the frontal here. Okay, front part of your brain. Okay, the association area involved in here. So what is the higher level thinking that takes place here? Your judgment, your impulse control, your motivation, your emotional responses, planning for the future, and thinking. And what they're finding out more and more is more and more development is happening during adolescence. Hence, why maybe teenagers are so they don't have impulse control. Freshmen, they just take it, or they don't think about what they are doing before they do it. Okay, because that's because that area is still developing. Okay. Also, we're going to find out it impacts our personality. The location portion of the cerebral cortex is just behind the forehead. Research was done by Phineas Gage, who uncovered that a lot of our personality comes from that portion of the brain, and you are going to do a case study on Phineas Gage tonight. The other part of the frontal lobe that it has your motor cortex. So you can see in the back part of the frontal lobe, this helps with movement, right? So I told you some of it is an association area, higher level thinking, and some of it is due to motor functions. So movement is controlled there. It's the back of the frontal lobe. When they did a lot of work with stimulating these areas, and what they found out when they stimulated this area of the brain, people would move different parts of their body. Key figures that studied that was Gustavo Furch and Edward Huntz uncovered areas of the motor cortex, and then Foster and Penfield did further mapping of the brain. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in class. The frontal lobe also has an area in it known as the Broca area. Okay. The function is that it controls muscle movement necessary to create sounds. So to speak. It's specifically on the left side of the frontal lobe. So it's not in both lobes, on the right and left. It's only on the left. Paul Broca is responsible for understanding the development of the Broca area. He noticed that somebody did get into an accident and was no longer able to speak or create sounds. And what he found was this area specifically was damaged. So he did further research with more people who've gotten in accidents or more people who had then maybe had an illness and this area was damaged and people were unable to speak. Responsible for speech production, words are produced here. Damage to this area impairs speaking. All right, moving on to the parietal lobe. That's the yellow lobe on here. Okay, the location of the cerebral cortex is on the top of the head pretty much, right behind the frontal lobe. The association area, so the higher level thinking, it's pretty much used for math reasoning. Okay, and then it also helps with the ability of touch. So the sense of touch is processed here in the parietal lobe. Okay, also included in the parietal lobe is the sensory cortex. So the sensory cortex is in the front of this lobe. It kind of backs up to the motor cortex. The sense of touch is handled in this area. So where touch, pressure, pain, all of that is registered in the sensory cortex. Our awareness of body movement and position. If this is damaged, we could lose the ability or the sensitivity of touch. The occipital. Okay, occipital is at the back of your head. The location portion of the cerebral cortex is just at the back of the brain. Okay, its function is responsible for vision. It's also known as kind of like the visual cortex. The visual cortex, kind of like the sensory cortex and the motor cortex, it also contains the visual cortex, which is where sight is registered. It receives written words and visual stimulation. It's at the very back of the occipital lobe here. And then the last one we have is the temporal. Okay, the temporal is in pink here. The function of the temporal lobe is involved in auditory processing. Okay, so hearing is the main function of the temporal. The association is it's also involved in long-term memory and areas associated with comprehension. So if I'm reading this to you, you're able to understand what it's all about. Okay, it contains the auditory cortex. Okay, the auditory cortex is area right here registered a lot of the times for sound, specifically in the temporal lobe. Okay, and then another area that you need to know is the Wernicke's area. Carl Wernicke is responsible for this. Wernicke's area area that interprets language comprehension. Damage to this area is impaired understanding and comprehension. So kind of like we talked about with the Broca area, the Wernicke's area is a specialized area, and the left parietal okay, that has problems understanding comprehension. So people can talk, but a lot of times what they're saying or what they're hearing, they don't understand it. They can't comprehend. If I were telling you a story about a dog taking a bath, okay, they might not understand what I was talking about with a dog taking a bath. Okay, that wouldn't make sense to them. Or when they were telling you a story, one time they would say, there was a time that my mom and I went to school and there was a giant dinosaur. It's like that whole story doesn't make sense. And that's a problem that they suffer with. Again, how he figured this out were people who had accidents and this area was damaged. Okay, as kind of a quick recap, I would make sure somewhere in your notes you did draw this image of the brain and you did label the different parts of the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. I would also make sure you know the different elements that are involved with each of the lobes. So this is the cerebral cortex. This is what separates us apart from other living species. It's where most of our higher level thinking is processed. Starts with the frontal lobe, which is the front part of the brain. It has the back part of the frontal lobe, has the motor cortex attached, and also in the left frontal lobe, there's the Broca area, which helps with the production of speech. Okay, then you have the parietal lobe, which has the ability of touch. Okay, the sensory cortex is in the front of the parietal lobe. Then you have the occipital lobe, which is in the back portion of your head. Occipital lobe has the visual cortex, which helps with vision. And lastly, you have the temporal lobe, which helps with hearing. You have the auditory cortex, and you have the Wernicke's area, which is your ability to comprehend. I will see you next time.